Our discussion of flexibility to this point has been an isolated link action. They're good tools. It's a tool that we have to understand and that we should appreciate and use in our toolbox. However, we don't move in an isolated manner. We do move through integrated movement patterns. We move in 3 planes of motion. And that's why I believe in the flexibility highways. And I say there's 5 flexibility highways, which we're going to delve into. Because the flexibility highways is dependent upon integrated movements. It's dependent on from the ground up. In fact, when I look at flexibility and I work with my clients on the flexibility highways, I don't think of the isolated action. I don't think of the isolated muscle. What I think when in terms of movement is think from the ground up. And when we think from the ground up and approach flexibility from the ground up, movement and our flexibility programs take an entirely different paradigm. But yet let's try and understand some of the concepts, some of the brief physiology of movement and why we stretch and what's going on with some of the tissues in our body, primarily proprioceptors. I often find it interesting when people talk about flexibility or proprioceptive training or balance training, when in fact they should all be integrated together. And if we look at what the proprioceptors do, generally speaking, what they essentially do, they're length and movement velocity sensors. We look at that muscle spindles essentially are responding to dynamic changes of muscle length. We also look at the fact that they're looking at and monitoring length detectors. They act to see as a muscle lengthens or as a muscle shortens, the spindles are going to lengthen or shorten to be able to match not only the neurosensors to the muscle, but also the fascial relationships and the fascial coverings to match the muscle tissue, because fascia and muscle are 2 different tissues, even though they integrate and work together. So if we can just kind of boil this all down, think of proprioceptors that run parallel in muscle fibers. Proprioceptors and muscle spindles are primarily stimulated when stretched. Now, that's not to say they don't give us information when they shorten, because they do, but they're primarily stimulated when stretched. Let me talk one brief point as an example. We'll look at somebody, the generic population of the elderly, the seniors, have this kyphotic posture. Well, there's a lot of shortening of muscle tissue. Their fear and their incidence and risk of falls increases, partly because the proprioceptors aren't working as acutely around the body and in 3 planes of motion as they did when we were young and spry and had full range of motion and had this swagger to our gait. Well, when the proprioceptors become somewhat desensitized, they're typically shortened. And if we want to get muscles to lengthen, we've got to position our clients to be able to lengthen tissue. So we'll address that a little bit later, but the fact remains is that proprioceptors will become primarily and more stimulated when they're lengthened. Also, movement is a gift. Movement is so important to alter spindle length and also to monitor the velocity of change. And their sensitivity to the velocity of change is critical. One of the proprioceptors we often hear about are Pacinian corpuscles. They provide information about joint compression, tension, and forces. Now, take a shoulder press as an example. You know that there's a certain amount of weight through the shoulder joint, primarily because of the proprioception of the Pacinian corpuscles that says, I've got 30 pounds over my head, I'm feeling the tension and the compression on the joint. It's those tissues that are sending signals to the nervous system saying that the joint is loaded. At the same time, when we don't have any load, those proprioceptors are not stimulated as much, so it's telling us the joint isn't compressed. When you get a tight joint, when you get the capsule and the tissues around the joint, that's going to shorten the tissues. Those Pacinian corpuscles also become somewhat inhibited, and it's telling us about some of the tissues that are going on as far as tensions. The most common, I would suspect, is the Golgi tendon organ. A good example of that is the knee-jerk reflex. You take the mallet, doctor looks at the patellar tendon, the knee goes into extension. What the Golgi tendon organ is doing, it's giving us information about continuous muscle tension. It's located within the muscle tendon itself, and it gives us information about excessive muscle contraction, excessive forces of muscle contraction. Take, for example, you have somebody who might jump off of a 10-foot high ladder. Once they hit the ground, they land, the muscles have a tendency to just collapse. We have a tendency to give out. It's because those Golgi tendon organs are being stretched to a point and they're sending an inhibitory an inhibitory signal to let the muscles relax so we don't overstretch, overcontract, and even possibly tear the muscle away from the bone. Golgi tendon organs are also continuously being remodeled, so to speak, in our movement patterns. When a child is young, an infant tries to feed itself, he or she finds every place but the mouth, but over time, the programming, the motor engrams, they start having a tendency to becoming more accurate, and they know where their mouth is now, and they'll start feeding themselves. And of course, mom and dad doesn't have to clean up their face. So Golgi tendon organs give us a lot of information. So proprioceptors are going to be stimulated with movement. And when we look at movement, again, in the flexibility highways principles and concepts, is that we're nothing more than a series of chain reactions, and that the fascia is actually what I'm concentrating on rather than the muscle tissue. We know that fascia surrounds muscle. We know that fascia connects muscle to bone. But what we have to start thinking about is that where one muscle and fascia end, another one is starting and conjoining, and very often, more times than not, those fascial tissues are connected. So we can look and create this linkage from distal to proximal, width-wise and even depth-wise, and we'll approach that in just a little bit. But let's look at again and review some of the characteristics of human movement. In integrated movement patterns, we go eccentric before concentric. We store about 3 to 9 times more energy when we go through eccentric deceleration, stabilize, and then concentric unload. If you try and jump, you can't do it very effectively without going down first before you go up. So we have to decelerate motion if we're going to initiate movement such as a jump, and we want to jump up, we first go down, then up, because the muscles load and then explode. Muscles move in 3 planes of motion, and in fact, all joints move in 3 planes of motion, so our flexibility should take us to integrate in 3 planes of motion. Muscles are stabilizers. And let me just broach on that for just a moment. If I lean forward, I'm going to feel tension in the back. As I lean forward, that tension is decelerating me to go forward. So those muscle tissues are lengthened. But the issue is that those muscles in back are helping stabilize my feet, my ankle, my knee, my hip, my low back. As they lengthen, they're stabilizing joints. But we also have to keep in mind that as stabilizers, and passive movement is a reactive movement, the muscles just reflexively react and lengthen to help stabilize my position so I'm able to hold my position or gather myself and bring me back to my original starting point. So when we look at integrated movements and we look at integrated flexibility, such as flexibility highways, we have to think that a lot of the motions that we're going to add to our flexibility highways are really passive movements, and passive movements, the muscles are being acted upon. The muscles are not doing the work. So as they're acted upon, they lengthen. It's a reaction. We stop, and then we come back to our start point. Muscles react to ground reaction forces and gravity. Gravity pushes down on us, and also ground reaction forces push up against us. Our muscles have to react a certain way. In fact, gravity is a stimulus for muscle function. Gravity can be our enemy if we're sedentary, but gravity can be a great friend to our muscles because it's going to, as I reach this way, gravity is taking me down here, but it's my muscle action that is being stimulated to overcome the effects of gravity. And then when I look at movement, and particularly flexibility, I think of the 5 flexibility highways. We have one on the anterior chain, we have one on the posterior chain, we've got a lateral flexibility highway, which is the most overlooked and we'll discuss, and then there's 2 X factors. Look at opposite hip and opposite shoulder. You have an anterior X factor and a posterior X factor, and let's explore some of those now. The anterior flexibility highway. Again, let me reiterate, don't think of muscle, think of connective tissue, think of the fascial relationships. Think longitudinal, think of latitudinal, and think of what's going in depth-wise as one muscle connects deeply with the viscera, with the deep muscle structures, the stabilizers as we commonly call them, because there is a connection. The reason I'm saying that is just by having somebody lean one way is my lateral muscles, as an example, are getting lengthened, and then I can take it in 3 planes of motion, and now I'm adding another plane to that one side frontal plane. I can add rotation or I can add sagittal plane movements. So with that being said, when I think of fascia rather than muscle, let's think of those connections. The anterior flexibility highway, I'm starting at the anterior tibialis. As that runs north, it connects with your distal quadriceps. Where the quadriceps come down across the knee, the anterior tibialis anterior comes up, and there's a fascial connection there. The quadriceps go north, and they connect to your hip flexors. The hip flexors go north and connect to the abdominals. The abdominals go north and connect to the pec into the cervical flexors. The pec can even go off on an angle to the shoulder. So when we look at those movements, and if I were to do a motion that takes me into extension, I'm lengthening that anterior flexibility highway. So a good range of motion through the anterior flexibility highway will enhance extension moments. You've got to allow somebody who has to reach up to have extension all the way down. When I've seen injuries and evaluated injuries and I see a limited range of motion, I'm thinking that may be the problem, but the symptom is telling me something, but the symptom is taking a hit for a lack of motion somewhere. The site of the injury typically is not the problem. It's often a joint level above or below that's a problem. So I need to understand where I might be limited in movement, in this case, the anterior flexibility highway. So again, anterior flexibility highway will enhance extension moments. Then we can look at the posterior flexibility highway that runs from the plantar surface of the foot, from the bottom of the foot. It runs from the toes to the calcaneus, from the calcaneus into the Achilles tendon, the Achilles tendon into the hamstring, and the Achilles tendon into the calf, and the calf muscle comes up and above and attaches at the femur. Likewise, then I've got, as the calf muscle comes up, those tissues, those fascia connects with the hamstring because the hamstring comes down and around and connects at the tibia. So we've got these hands that come up and cross one way and then some that come down the other, but they're connected together. The hamstrings go north and connect to the ischial tuberosity. The hamstrings connect to the sacrum through the sacrotuberous ligament. That goes and connects very closely to the erector spinae. So we go from the hamstrings into the glute up into the hip north up into the erector spinae. As the erector spinae come up, they attach at the occiput, which come up into the fascia of the cranium, and actually can come all the way down to our eyebrows. So when we look at the limitations of motion, if there's any tightness in the foot, in the calf, in the hamstring, in the glute, in the back, it's all going to affect each other because think of this fascial relationship. If I have tightness in my shirt here, it's going to create motion and lack of motion and tightness somewhere else. I may feel the tightness back here, but the problem might be here. In the flexibility highways, it's the same thing. A good range of motion through the posterior flexibility highways will allow me flexion moments. And we have to make sure that we include all those components through the posterior flexibility highway to enhance good flexion. So I can go through extension and then immediately go into flexion, and I'm getting this entire integrated chain from extension to flexion on the muscles on the front and the back to enhance flexion extension or sagittal plane movements. Now as we look at this, and I use these photos here, they were photos from Anatomy Trains, the second edition, and Thomas Myers did a fabulous job in some dissection. And we look at the posterior flexibility highway, we see how these are connected through the plantar surface of the foot into the calf to the hamstring conjoint, into the sacrotuberous ligament, into the sacral fascia, into the erector spinae, up to the occiput. So this is showing this linear linkage that goes from distal to proximal, or if you want to think proximal to distal, but you also see it on the skeleton and how this is all related. The most overlooked flexibility highway is the lateral flexibility highway. I work with the senior population, I work with the apparently healthy, but I also do a lot of work with multi-sport athletes, endurance athletes. And if any of you by chance work with runners, swimmers, or cyclists, you may see in their gait that there's not a whole lot of sway in their hips. They're very sagittal plane dominant. The lateral flexibility highway is going to allow frontal plane or side-to-side movements. And that's critical because if we have good frontal plane movement, that's going to enhance rotation. And if you're limited in frontal plane, you're going to be limited in rotation. And rotation, the transverse plane is our most powerful plane of movement. The lateral flexibility highway goes from the perineals up into the iliotibial band. From the iliotibial band into the tensor fasciae lata, glute medius, glute minimus, quadratus lumborum, into the obliques, into the intercostals. Depending on which way I hold my arm, it could go into my lat, into my rotator cuff, into my tricep, into my forearm flexors. And if I were to just drive from the bottom up, I don't want to do a top-down movement. I don't want to just keep my hips in position and lean this way because my lumbar spine doesn't like it. But if I drive my hips out to the side and I keep my big toe joint, my first ray of that foot that I'm stretching on that hip, that corresponding foot, and I drive my hips out, now I get a better motion through and range of motion through the entire lateral column. This is the most overlooked and probably the most critical, but we can also have a whole lot of fun trying to stretch this because it's going to free up a lot of movements. When we look at, again, these photos from Myers, we look at the perineals, into the iliotibial band, into the glute medius, into the glute minimus, tensor fasciae lata, obliques, all the way up the lateral column into the shoulder, and it can really even affect the lateral cervical flexors. These are all tied together. Now, one point I want to make about the lateral flexibility highway. Very often I'll have people who come into us and say, you know, I've got some iliotibial band problems. I'm very tight here, and we'll often stretch that. Some people even use foam rollers. I'm not saying good or bad. Foam rollers at the right application is a good tool to have in your toolbox. However, the question we've got to look at when we see that iliotibial band is tight, make sure we take a look at the pelvis. If you see somebody who is an anteriorly tilted pelvis, that's going to create motion at the pelvis, which could be lengthening the iliotibial band. We don't necessarily want to stretch an already stretched muscle tissue. We've got to address the cause. And we'll talk about some of those strategies and posture. When we look at a global view, and you'll look at the body of how it moves and how it was miraculously put together, we look at the foot. The foot is a mobile adapter. As the foot hits the ground, you want the foot to collapse to absorb forces, and as we move forward, you want to have the foot lock up to be a cantilever to help propel us forward. Likewise, we'd like to have a very mobile ankle. If the ankle gets a bit gunked up, you're going to lose some sagittal plane motion. You're going to lose dorsiflexion, which is going to create havoc on what goes on at the foot. And it's also what we'll see is going to impact the hip flexors in a great way. So you want to have a mobile adapter in the foot, but yet you want to have it stable in the foot. You want to have a mobile ankle. Let's move up the chain and look at the knee. You want to have stability at the knee, but you want to have some degree of mobility, but you want to make sure that knee isn't too mobile. One of the most mobile regions of the body is the pelvis. You want to make sure that the hip is mobile. Then we go up to the lumbar spine. We want to keep some mobility in the lumbar spine. The other most mobile region of the body is the thoracic spine. So we want to have mobility in the thoracic spine. If we lose mobility in the thoracic spine and/or we lose mobility in the hip, a lot of motion now is taken up by the lumbar spine, and that's where we often start to see low back problems. So we have to address what's going on at the hip, what's going on at the thoracic spine to help protect the low back. But at the same time, we have to look at what's going on at the knee, at the ankle, and the foot. So we have a thoracic spine that we hopefully is mobile. You want to have a shoulder girdle, not the shoulder joint. I want to see if my scapula is able to be mobile and glide on the rib cage. Because if I have good mobility of my scapula, I can have good motion through my shoulder joint without straining the shoulder joint, but at the same time I can keep the shoulder joint stable. I want to have a stable shoulder on a mobile scapula, but I want to have that scapula also be able to have the musculature around it create stability. Then I move up to the cervical spine and I want to have mobility in my cervical spine. So if you look at this chart, we go at alternating levels of mobile, stable in a healthy body. If we have too much mobility somewhere, reflexively there's going to probably be some immobility in an area that should be mobile. Or if you see an area that should be mobile which should be mobile becomes too stable, we see that that stable area now becomes a little bit more mobile, and that's where we increase the risk of injuries. So there's some key relationships we need to look at as we move. Now keep in mind we're looking at movement from the ground up. I'm viewing flexibility from the ground up, not in an isolated fashion. I need to make sure that I have good motion through my toe joint, my great toe, because that's going to help propel me forward. Likewise, I want to have good mobility in my calf. I'm also going to have good mobility through my hip flexor in my calf, so I need to stretch those together. My hip flexors and abdominals have to have a good relationship, and my abdominals and my pecs has to have good relationship to allow optimal movement. So the hip flexors and the opposite shoulder and the glute and the opposite shoulder on the posterior side need to make up good motion. For the great toe and the calf to work together, as I move forward and propel off the foot, you're going to see that having good dorsiflexion of the great toe is also going to help drive the knee into extension and the hip extension. So when we look at stretching, we've got to make sure that we get the foot and the big toe to have good mobility. At the same time, I want to make sure that my calf and my hip flexors stretch together. As you walk, and I invite you to stand up and walk around, keep your heel down on the ground, keep the heel of your trail leg down on the ground. You're going to feel tension in your calf and the hip flexor of the same side. I've got to have good motion through my hip flexor and my calf to allow my pelvis to get turned down properly, to turn on the abdominals, let alone have good efficient movement forward. If I have tightness in my calf, I'm going to limit my hip extension. If I have tightness in my hip flexors and I can't get into good hip extension, I'm going to limit my dorsiflexion. Not only am I going to limit the length of my gait stride, but at the same time I'm going to limit my ability to go through rotation. I'm going to limit my ability to go into the frontal plane. And this all ties into integrated motions. One of the biggest keys, one of my biggest rocks in flexibility is that I make sure that I get a good stretch in the hip flexor and the calf of the same side. It's also going to help proper knee function, because we'll see later on in integrated movements that the calf really has an impact upon producing proper knee extension. So if I were to go into an anterior lunge, let's say it's an opposite leg or a staggered stance of an anterior lunge and reach up, now I'm getting stretch in my same side calf, my same side hip flexor, but also into my abdominals, into my pec, into my shoulder, into shoulder flexion. In fact, to enhance shoulder flexion, I better have good range of motion in my same side hip flexor. So there's where we start looking at the integrated relationships. If I see tightness in somebody trying to go into shoulder flexion, I want to see what's going on down below and see what the range of motion is there. The abdominals are the crossroads with the back to transmit forces from the ground up and from the top down. If I'm a thrower and I want to be able to transmit force through a throw, I've got to have proper motion and action through the lower extremity, through the abdominals, or I should say through the hip, through the abdominals, to have the force come out through a forceful throw. The friends of the abdominals, when you look at the fascial connections, the friends of the abdominals is going to be the hip, because the abdominals attach right next to the hip flexor. We've already demonstrated that the hip flexor is tied in and has to have good extension in the hip flexor to turn on the abdominals, which is also dependent upon having good dorsiflexion in your calf. In your ankle. So we have to have lengthening of the same side calf, the lengthening of the same side hip flexor to allow the abdominals to lengthen in the sagittal plane. And as we walk, we're in this contralateral reach position. As we walk and one hip is extended and the shoulder is rotated in the other way, you get the abdominals to lengthen in the transverse plane. So I have to have good motion through my pec to allow shoulder extension, which will allow my shoulders to rotate, which will turn my abdominals on in the transverse plane. My hip is extended, which is going to turn them on in the sagittal plane, but my hip is highly dependent upon what goes on at the calf. So the absolute friends, as I call it, the absolute friends of the abdominals is the calf, the hip, the shoulder, and pec region. Now let's explore the anterior flexibility highway. If you look at this photo and you look at the diagram, you're going to see that the adductors really run on an oblique angle. In fact, they go from lateral up medially towards the bottom of the pelvis at the pubis ramus. You look at the opposite oblique and the opposite pec, there is a relative parallel alignment, the fibrous alignment of the adductors through the obliques into the pec. If you have somebody who is in a staggered stance and rotates around, such as a thrower, or somebody who's just taking something and reaches back, these structures better be stretched together because we're going through rotation. Again, let's take a look at the obliquity of the angles of the fibers, of the adductors of the oblique and the pec, which promote rotational movements. They better be stretched that way because we're in this position. If I extend my arm up, all of a sudden my bicep, my forearm flexors become part of this flexibility highway. I need to integrate those together. I need to be able to stretch those together, not just in the rotational plane of the transverse plane, but I can also drive it through sagittal plane or go side to side. So slight modifications in these positions are going to enhance motion of this flexibility highway in all three planes of motion. So the fibrous alignment should be stretched together. And it's more keenly seen in the posterior flexibility highway. Look at the opposite lat and the opposite glute. Those fibers run through and share a crossroads through the lumbar fascia, and we see that the fibers of the lat and the glute almost run in a direct parallel line. In flexion and rotation movements, such as you're picking something up forward and to the side of you, that opposite lat and opposite glute are being stretched. We have to have good range of motion through there to reduce the torque and the stretch upon the lumbar fascia and the tissues in the lumbar spine. This is going to promote flexion and rotational movements, and it's going to just make motion come through the thoracic cage and the pelvis more than rotation through the lumbar spine. So the posterior flexibility highway will enhance rotation, but yet forward flexion. And then when we look again at these throwing movements as an example, or reaching movements as an example, as the pelvis, as we move, rotates anteriorly, it's going to create length in the abdominals and the hip flexors. That is why we need to stretch those together. So the abdominals and hip flexors need to work together. So that's a lot of information all of a sudden, and there's progressions that we can use that we can take somebody from a staggered stance or an integrated flexibility highway static position and then slowly transform them into movement patterns. We can start very remedially and then progress into something a little bit more dynamic, because the key here is we need to make sure that we match a movement pattern to the flexibility highway stretch that we've worked on. Because if we improve range of motion in a particular plane of motion, but we haven't given somebody an exercise to help control and stabilize and decelerate motion, I think we may have set them up for injury. Because if we've given somebody increased range of motion, but they can't control it, they will not have the ability to withstand those forces and control those forces in all three planes. So there must be an accompanying stretch and an accompanying exercise to mirror or match that particular stretch pattern in the flexibility highways. You can view some of those in the video clips that we will accompany with this that will be flexibility highways in motion. So when we put this all together, if I have a client who's coming into my clinic, one of the things I have everybody do is an active warm-up. Now, it could be a treadmill or a bike, or it could be an elliptical machine, and that's fine, but typically they work in one plane of motion, or there's a predominance in one plane of motion. What I'd like to do is an integrated dynamic warm-up that after they feel comfortable on, if it's the bike or the treadmill if they want, but I'm having them do various movement patterns. I'm having them work in three planes of motion so we get movement from the ground up, from the foot into the ankle, into the hip, into the thoracic cage, up through the shoulder girdle, into the cervical spine, because if we get dynamic triplane movement actions, such as low-level walking, we can do jogging, we could do easy jogging with spins, we could do Z patterns, we could do diagonal patterns, we could do lunge patterns, hops, jumps. We can use, and if you haven't used it yet, you got to try and use this new thing that's coming out called the Viper and use that lightly in all three planes of motion. We have to be able to dynamically get our clients to warm up. Now I've got them moving in three planes of motion, then we go through our training program. Our training program is going to enhance movement in three planes of motion. It's going to strengthen us in three planes of motion, but they're typically integrated. Now, is that to say that we should never do isolation? I'm not saying that. There are times that we do isolated exercise. There's times that we'll do isolated stretches. My approach with this is I believe that we need to cover the full spectrum of movement, the full spectrum of exercise, the full spectrum of flexibility. I like to do the isolated first. The reason being, especially when it comes to exercise, the reason being is, first, I'm doing a concentric action and it's shortening the muscle. Secondly, it's one plane of motion. And thirdly, I know it's concentric. It will give me strength. It will neuromuscularly turn on the tissues. And I'm going to feel that re-education, but especially if I have somebody who's looking for hypertrophy, I don't mind doing that first. Sometime either immediately after or sometime during the program, I'm now going to get them into an integrated triplane movement. Because if I do the isolated first, again, I know it's single plane, I know it's isolated, I know it's concentric, but in true human movement, I'll go eccentric first. It's integrated in triplane. On the one hand, I'm gaining my strength and that isolation if that's the goal for my client, because remember, we have to meet the goals and objectives of our clients and the programs we design for them. But on the other hand, I know that this is going to create more mobility, but also stability in all three planes of motion. So I'm meeting both ends of the spectrum and actually have had better results when I've combined the two and I've looked at tradition versus functional integrated movement patterns. And my flexibility is the same way. If I see that I have to do an isolated stretch, I'll do it, but then at some point during the program, and especially after training, I'll do the 5 flexibility highway stretches, and that's where the post-workout or the post-stretching comes into play. My recommendation is do your integrated static stretching at the end. The body's warmer. It's easier to get the tissues to lengthen through 3 planes of motion, but it's also easier to get it to its resting or slightly greater than resting length if we need to. I'll hold each position for 15 to 30 seconds, and I'll do about 3 reps each. In fact, there's times that I have my clients who are those that are very bound up, very immobile, I'll have them stretch a couple times a day. I have found great success with this. When I look at it and I look back in my career, I started out with isolated movements. I started out with isolated stretching. Being a former professional athlete, we did some of this, but some of the isolated exercise that we did didn't necessarily feel athletic-like. I then started doing integrated movements, and with the integrated movements, I felt more athletic, I felt more dynamic, but at the same time, when I was working at that end, strictly at that end, I felt like I wasn't getting the total strength and hypertrophy that I needed. When I bridged the gap, when I went from the traditional side to the integrated functional side, I found better results. And the issue that we're here for, the primary objective that we're all here for, is to help those that we serve. If we're able to do so and start appreciating movement and understand how we move from the ground up, nothing in my 29 years of practice has affected people's lives more than understanding human movement, than understanding integrated flexibility. I guarantee you this is going to open up an entirely new paradigm to how you approach exercise and how you approach movement, and it's going to have a great impact and great results upon your clients' results, their life, and their overall well-being.